Being a tourist is supposed to be fun, right? But in some places, you really have to keep your guard up. Scams are common, and you might even feel like you're constantly watching your back. Unfortunately, some people let their guard down, and that's when they become easy targets. Today, we're diving into the chilling story of a man who took advantage of just that. Charles Sobhraj, a man known as one of the most notorious fraudsters and serial killers in the world. In the mid-1970s, a dark mystery began to unravel across Asia as young tourists started to vanish under strange and suspicious circumstances. It wasn't just a case of people going missing. Families, desperate for answers, were filing missing persons reports from Thailand to Nepal, and the pieces weren't adding up. The story truly begins with the disappearance of a Dutch couple, Henk Pintanya and Cornelia Hemker, who were traveling through Thailand. Their families, alarmed by the sudden loss of communication, reached out to the Dutch embassy for help. This is where Herman Knippenberg, a Dutch diplomat based in Bangkok, entered the picture. When Knippenberg started investigating, he found not only their missing case, but a disturbing pattern of other tourists disappearing under similar circumstances. In each instance, the travelers had last been seen in the company of a charming, mysterious man. Knippenberg began piecing together clues, like passports and movement, that linked several victims to this mysterious figure, later identified as Charles Sobhraj. As Knippenberg dug deeper, he realized he was on the trail of something far bigger than a few isolated disappearances. The more he uncovered, the more connections he made to other missing tourists from around the world. Soon, it became clear Sobhraj wasn't just scamming tourists, he was killing them. It was this investigation, sparked by families and led by Knippenberg, that eventually connected a series of disappearances across Asia to Charles Sobhraj, setting off an international manhunt for one of the world's most notorious serial killers. Before diving into his brutal killing spree, let's first take a closer look at who Charles Sobhraj really was and why he was so dangerously cunning. Charles Sobhraj was born on April 6, 1944, in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, to an Indian Sindhi businessman, Sobhraj Hachan Baunani, and a Vietnamese shop worker, Chun Luan Phung. His father refused to acknowledge him from birth, and his parents never officially married. This left Charles in a tricky spot. He was raised by his mother and her partner, a French army man. Life wasn't easy for young Charles. When his mother and her partner had their own biological children, Charles was pushed aside, neglected, and left feeling like an outsider in his own home. Even though his stepfather legally adopted him, Charles always felt a deep emotional disconnect, a sense of abandonment that he never seemed to shake. Could this childhood neglect have played a role in shaping the mind of one of the world's most notorious criminals? Some psychologists think so. As a teenager, Charles Sobhraj didn't just get into trouble. He seemed to thrive on it. Starting with petty crimes, it wasn't long before his rebellious streak escalated into something far more serious. At just 19, he was sentenced to his first prison stint for burglary in 1963. He ended up in Poissy prison near Paris, but even behind bars, Charles had a knack for finding ways to live comfortably. He bribed the prison staff, ensuring that even in jail he could enjoy a life of relative ease, a taste of the luxury that would always tempt him. During this time, Charles crossed paths with Félix Desconia, a wealthy young man who volunteered at the prison. Félix took a liking to Charles, and before long, the two had formed a close bond. Felix welcomed him into his luxurious Parisian home, giving Charles a glimpse into the high life. It wasn't long before Charles started weaving his way deeper into the criminal world, using his charm and cleverness to expand his reach. He began pulling off a series of sophisticated burglaries, frauds, and shady schemes, amassing a small fortune in the process. Around this time, Charles met Chantal Compagnon, a young woman from a traditional Parisian family. Despite their very different backgrounds, the two fell in love, and Charles, ever the romantic, proposed. But in classic Sobhraj fashion, the moment didn't go smoothly. On the very same day of his proposal, Charles was arrested for driving a stolen car while trying to escape the police. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison, yet Chantal stayed by his side, loyal throughout his incarceration and beyond. Marriage didn't slow Charles down, though. In fact, it marked the beginning of his next adventure. In 1970, with Chantal pregnant, they fled to Asia, trying to outrun a growing list of arrest warrants. Armed with fake documents, they traveled through Eastern Europe, befriending tourists along the way, then robbing them. By the time they arrived in Mumbai, India, Chantal had given birth to their child, while Charles had set up a car theft and smuggling operation. But it wasn't long before things took a turn. In 1973, Charles was arrested after a botched armed robbery at the Ashok Hotel in New Delhi. Ever resourceful, he faked illness, drugged a hospital guard, and managed to escape. But his freedom was short-lived. He was caught again, and this time had to borrow money from his estranged father to make bail. Once out, Charles fled to Kabul, where he continued his crime spree, preying on tourists along the famous hippie trail. He was arrested again, escaped again, and it was becoming a vicious cycle. In the midst of all this, Charles teamed up with his younger half-brother, Andre, to expand their criminal operations in Turkey and Greece. But their partnership didn't end well. The pair was arrested in Athens, and Charles, true to form, hatched a bold plan to escape, using a clever identity switch. The plan fell apart, though, and while Charles managed to get away, Andre was left behind to face the consequences. Even after all these near misses, Charles didn't stop. He continued his life on the run, defrauding people all over Asia. He posed as everything from a gem dealer to a drug trafficker, charming tourists and conning them out of their money. For Charles, it seemed there was no other way to survive. Crime wasn't just a way of life, it was the only life he knew. Charles Sobhraj's life took another dark twist when he met Marie-Andrée Leclerc, a Canadian tourist from Quebec who became romantically involved with Charles Sobhraj during her travels in India. After meeting him in 1975, Marie quickly fell under Sobhraj's spell, becoming deeply loyal to him and turning a blind eye to his crimes. She remained devoted and followed him across Asia, assisting him in several of his criminal activities. She helped him in luring, drugging, and ultimately murdering several of his victims. Sobhraj used her to manipulate tourists, especially women, by offering them friendship or assistance, which made it easier for him to gain their trust before robbing or killing them. Aside from Marie, Charles also partnered with Ajay Chaudhary, a young Indian man who would become his accomplice in both scams and eventually murders. Their crime spree took a deadly turn in 1975, when Charles and Ajay committed their first known murder. But, as is often the case with Charles, the truth is murky. There are two versions of events: Charles' version and the investigator's version. According to Charles, most of his victims died from accidental overdoses of drugs. He claimed he didn't kill them. They simply took too much, and he just happened to be there. But investigators paint a very different picture. They believe Charles murdered anyone who threatened to expose him or posed a risk to his freedom. The first victim linked to Charles was Teresa Knowlton, a young woman from Seattle. She had traveled to Thailand in 1975 to explore Buddhist culture and planned to visit Nepal afterward. But in October of that year, she crossed paths with Sobhraj, who charmed her and lured her to a resort in Pattaya, where he was staying with his accomplices. It's unclear exactly where it happened. Some say it was at the resort, others claim it was at a bar, but at some point, Sobhraj drugged Teresa. Soon after, she was stripped, dressed in a bikini, and taken out to sea. 5 days later, a farmer found her body floating face down in the Gulf of Thailand, wearing a floral bikini. At first, it seemed like a tragic swimming accident, but 2 months later, the truth emerged. Teresa had been murdered. When questioned about her death, Sobhraj claimed she was smuggling heroin, and that's why he killed her. Sobhraj's next victim was Vitaly Hakim, a Sephardic Jew with a nomadic lifestyle. His burned body was discovered on the road to the Pattaya resort where Sobhraj had been staying. Not long after, Vitaly's French girlfriend, Charmaine Carew, arrived in Thailand looking for him. Tragically, Charmaine was soon found dead, drowned near Pattaya, and like Teresa, she was dressed in a bikini. Although the connection wasn't made right away, the fact that both women were found in similar bikinis eventually led to Sobhraj being nicknamed the Bikini Killer. Things escalated when Charles met Dutch students Henk Betania and his girlfriend Cornelia Hemker in Hong Kong. Henk, 29, and Cornelia, 25, were a Dutch couple who got engaged and crossed paths with Sobhraj in Hong Kong. He charmed them and invited them to visit Thailand, where things took a dark turn. Once they arrived, Sobhraj secretly poisoned them. As the couple started to realize something was wrong, they made plans to expose him. Sensing the danger, Charles acted swiftly and murdered them both. Tragically, their bodies were found on December 16, 1975, strangled and burned. According to the autopsy, they had been set on fire while still alive. These murders played a key role in Sobhraj's downfall. Dutch diplomat Herman Knippenberg and his wife, Angela, began investigating their disappearance and gathered critical evidence, which eventually put Sobhraj on Interpol's radar. Cornelia was also wearing a bikini at the time. After these murders, Charles and his lover Marie fled to Nepal, using Henk and Cornelia's passports. There, they continued their deadly game, killing Connie Bronzik, a 29-year-old American, and her 26-year-old Canadian partner, Laurent Ormond Carrière. Between December 21st and 22nd, 1975, they were murdered by Sobhraj, and their bodies were found in separate locations, badly charred with multiple stab wounds. But the walls were closing in. Suspicion was growing among those around Charles and Marie, and they fled once again, this time to Calcutta, India. In need of new identities, they murdered an Israeli scholar named Avoni Jacob and took his passport. Using the stolen identity, they made their way to Bangkok, where they were questioned by the police in connection to the murders, and miraculously, they were released. By now, the bodies were stacking up, and Charles had become the target of an international manhunt. In May 1976, Interpol issued an arrest warrant for him, accusing him of 4 murders in Thailand. Undeterred, Charles returned to Asia and started assembling a new gang in Bombay. His next victims included Jean-Luc Solomon, a Frenchman who died after being poisoned during a robbery. Charles claimed that Solomon wasn't supposed to die. The poison was only meant to knock him out, but as usual, things didn't go as planned. Then came the fateful July of 1976 in New Delhi. Charles, now joined by 3 female accomplices, tricked a group of French postgraduate students into letting them act as tour guides. He drugged them with poisoned pills, but the drugs took effect faster than Charles expected. While most of the students passed out, 3 of them realized something was terribly wrong. They fought back, overpowering Charles and his accomplices. This led to their capture, and under questioning, the whole sinister operation began to unravel. Charles and his gang were arrested, charged, and sent to Tihar jail. It seemed like the end of the road for Charles Sobhraj, but as we know, his story is far from over. While Charles Sobhraj was imprisoned in New Delhi, it didn't feel much like a prison sentence for him. Even after being sentenced to 12 years, Charles was as manipulative and cunning as ever. He managed to smuggle precious gems into prison by hiding them in his body, which he used to bribe guards and live in relative luxury. Far from a typical inmate, Charles enjoyed gourmet meals, watched TV, and befriended both the guards and other prisoners, turning the prison into his personal playground. His charm and confidence were on full display when he gave interviews to journalists and authors, like those from O's Magazine and Random House. During these conversations, he openly discussed his past crimes, only to later retract his statements. He went so far as to paint himself as a sort of anti-hero, claiming that his actions were a form of retribution against what he saw as Western imperialism in Asia, a bizarre attempt to justify his actions. By the time Charles had served 10 years of his sentence, the Thai statute of limitations on his crimes was close to expiring. If it did, Charles could avoid extradition to Thailand, where he would likely face execution for murder. To buy himself more time, Charles threw a lavish party for his fellow prisoners and guards in 1986, spiking their food and drink with sleeping drugs. After they all passed out, he simply walked out of prison. His freedom was short-lived, though. He was arrested again at a restaurant in Goa and slapped with an additional 10 years on his sentence. Charles was finally released from prison on February 17, 1997, due to a combination of legal technicalities and the disappearance of witnesses. With no country willing to extradite him, Indian authorities allowed him to return to France. Once back in Paris, Charles embraced his infamy. He charged hefty fees for interviews and photographs, and even sold the rights to his life story for a reported $15 million. In 2003, for reasons that remain unclear, Charles made the inexplicable decision to return to Nepal, a country where he was still wanted for the 1975 murder of Connie Jo Bronzik. His return was likely driven by overconfidence and a desire for attention. It wasn't long before a journalist spotted him in the Kathmandu casino and reported his presence to the police. Charles was arrested, and the 1975 double murder case was reopened. In 2004, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Connie Jo Bronzik. Despite appeals and efforts by his supporters, including a legal case brought by his former wife, Chantal Compagnon, to the European Court of Human Rights, Charles remained imprisoned. He even caused a stir by announcing his engagement to his lawyer's daughter, Nihita Biswas, who was 44 years younger than him, adding another dramatic twist to his already notorious life. In 2014, Charles was convicted of the 1975 murder of Canadian tourist Laurent Carrière, adding 20 more years to his sentence. Despite these convictions, Charles remained composed, likely believing that his charm and manipulation could once again secure his freedom. Over the years, multiple different accounts, many of them supplied by Sobhraj himself, have emerged about how many people he murdered. His flat in Bangkok, when searched, had revealed many more passports and driver's licenses than victims discovered. Some died, some survived, but he is believed to have killed at least 12 young travelers between 1974 and 1976, and up to almost 30 people in total. But what about his accomplices? Did they get punished for assisting his crimes? In 1976, when both Marie and Sobhraj were arrested in India, Marie was sentenced to life in prison for her role in the murders. Marie maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming that she was manipulated and controlled by Sobhraj. While imprisoned, she suffered from cancer and was eventually released on compassionate grounds in 1983. She returned to Canada, where she died from her illness in 1984, just a year after her release. Ajay Chaudhary, who was a close associate and second in command to Charles Sobhraj during the height of their criminal activities in the mid-1970s, disappeared in 1976 in Malaysia. He was last seen with Sobhraj during a gemstone heist, after which only Sobhraj emerged from the forest where they had gone together. It is widely believed that Sobhraj may have killed him, but there are unconfirmed sightings of Ajay in West Germany and rumors that he might be hiding in Nepal. His whereabouts remain unknown, and his status is still considered a mystery. There were more accomplices, but their sentences were significantly shorter than his. After serving their time, they were released and have since faded from the public eye. Eventually, Charles Sobhraj was released on December 23, 2022. The court's decision was based on humanitarian grounds, which allow prisoners who show good behavior and have served a significant portion of their sentence to be released. Following his release, Sobhraj was deported to France, where he settled on December 24, 2022. Was he remorseful about his crimes? Well, I don't think so. Sobhraj has never shown any real remorse for what he did. Instead of feeling guilt, it seems he views his criminal past as a way to maintain his notoriety. He's capitalized on it through interviews, book deals, and media portrayals. And the media has certainly played along. His story has fascinated people for decades, leading to books, documentaries, including The Serpent on Netflix, and even a major film. But behind the media attention lies the harsh reality of a man responsible for taking many lives. While the public may be intrigued by his story, let's not forget the families of his victims who still need closure. And there are likely other victims whose stories remain untold. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.